To be here, and yes, happy to take that for a start. And perhaps I may very briefly, what did I find that was working well? I think that in general our flood programme has been effective, and I think it has stood up to the last 6 months of challenge pretty robustly, and I think we deal with incidents pretty well. Point one. And point two, the people are wonderful at all levels. And one of the great pleasures of my job has been going around the country and seeing work in progress. And it never fails to be an inspirational experience. What's not working so well? Actually, I'll say one other thing that I think was very strong. I think they were very good at climate change. I think they set a good example within the public service by setting a tight net zero challenge and setting out upon it. What I did find, though, that there was not enough emphasis on the day job of running the organisation. And I think that what Philip and I have both been involved in running serious businesses before, the order force in Philip's case, and I think that has made a bit of difference. There wasn't enough attention on delivery, and there were aspects where we were falling behind where we should have been. I think in particular we were very behind on permitting, which was most unfortunate for business and people looking for permits. And I was warned very early on that our water regulation was not where it should be. And so that has been an area of focus for me and certainly for Philip after he started. And the other thing I would say is that the board didn't have sufficient visibility of some of those issues and didn't dig deep into some of the critical matters in front of us. And I think that certainly the latter, digging deep particularly into, we had a water industry transformation project review, for example, in December, which was quite transformational in terms of our approach and how we are going to take it forward. I think that's been very important.
Thank you. Philip, you've also arrived recently. What are your impressions?
Well, it's lovely to be here. I think, like the Chair, I think that the calibre and depth of work on flooding has been very impressive, and we can talk a bit about the programme if it comes up, but I've had the opportunity to look at lots of big capital programmes across government in my career, and I think the way we're handling this is definitely above average. Obviously, always room for improvement, but I think a very solid way of thinking about flood risk. I think the second thing I'd say in terms of the good, the quality and calibre of criminal work done in the agency is very high. And in the last year, we've strengthened that with the Joint Waste Crime Unit and new funding from government to tackle waste crime more effectively, new partnerships with the National Crime Agency, with HMRC, and that I think is working very well. Areas for improvement. So as the Chair has said, basics I think is probably one of the key themes. So everything from answering letters, dealing with customer inquiries, making sure that we're meeting our turnaround time for decision making needs to improve. It is improving. But it's taken a lot of focus to get there. Secondly, I think there's something about the agency's regulatory mindset that needs a bit of a boost. It has slightly lost confidence as a regulator, and a lot of the casework that I see, casework that members of Parliament raise with me, is about times when permits are just not being adhered to. And there's a slight sense that's drifting a little bit, and we need to redraw expectations about what's happening. And we're doing that, noticeably in our practice on landfill and waste, where we've actually been a much more forward-leaning regulator in recent months. That, I think, is paying dividends. And then lastly, we have really good IT workers and a lot of IT qualified staff, but we're not at the forefront of using modernised technology in our work, whether that's in publishing data that's geographically available, whether that's in using AI to streamline our processes and reduce the work on our staff. There's a lot to be done, I think, to improve our basic IT and transformation. That will, I think, improve the efficiency of the business. It's quite a staff-focused business compared with the ones I worked in previously. We're trying to think about how we turn that round and we try and bring some modernised IT. I am very struck by feedback I've had from stakeholders that says that they want to see us publishing more data and being more transparent. They rely upon us for data for their work around the area, and they want to see more of it. And they want to see platforms where they can interrogate that data and they can actually see it being very visible. Now, we've just started that effort. We published the storm overflow data a few weeks ago. We did that in a mapped form, which is very, very open. I want us to go further on that, a bit more like we see in Wales, where I think our colleagues in Natural Resources Wales have a better platform for their IT work to try and make sure people can get the information they need about the environment and casework directly. And when on sort of basics, it's worth noting we have 48,000 FOI requests a year. I think that's equal to the whole of the rest of Whitehall. And that is in part because we don't publish enough material easily. So people have to go an FOI because they can't get hold of things they want to know. So quite a lot there, I think, for us to work on. As Alan has said, I think the calibre of staff there has really taken me aback. They are very motivated, very knowledgeable. They have genuine depth of expertise in many things they do, and they work incredibly hard. So that is a really great place to start my tenure.
Thank you. Well, I think on behalf of the committee, we all come across members of your staff in our local constituencies and in sort of regional fora, and I'm sure, and people are nodding, colleagues would agree that with what you've just said about the quality of your staff and their diligence, certainly in terms of flood response, whenever the warnings are out, they're out there throughout all weathers at all times of day and night, and I think we should put on record that that's a testament to their commitment to the role. So I'm grateful for your comments about that. So that's the good news. There are lots of criticisms about the performance of the EA, and we'll be coming on to some of them during the course of this session. Before I sort of get into that, I'd just like to pick up your comment on landfill and waste. I've recently had representation made by the methane processors who own and operate landfill sites that the ROCs regime is expiring in 5 years' time, less than 5 years' time, 2027, with no sign of a replacement scheme, and that there is risk to what happens to methane, which obviously is a multiple times worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Are you familiar with this challenge? Are you doing anything about mitigating it or talking to government about a refresh of such a ROC scheme or some other means of managing that problem?
It's not primarily our concern, the ROCs regime, of course, but I completely agree with the point you make. I think at a time when we are encouraging the capture of methane to prevent damage from that, for us to be talking of making the collection of gas, effectively it would make it, not having ROCs would make it non-economic, and therefore for it to become a cost to the operator instead of a benefit, it doesn't feel like the right thing to me. So we haven't yet, but it is certainly something that on which I think we should join in the requests for reconsideration.
But I would urge you to speak to in your regular discussions with the right departments that we do something about this. I think it would be just flared off, and that would have damage to the environment. It would lose the baseload electricity which is currently generated, and that would require replacement. And then, of course, a lot of it would just leach into the atmosphere, which we obviously don't want to happen. So I'm glad you take that view, Alan. In relation to the role as a regulator, you mentioned permitting, Philip, as an area that you need to look at, and we will be coming on to this in relation to water in particular, but many of the NGOs have expressed a lack of, their concerns about the lack of rigour in maintaining licence conditions, in particular for the water companies, but not exclusively. And of course, with the Ofwat and DEFRA are currently subject to an OEP investigation into this issue. Is there anything that you can say to us, bearing in mind there is such an investigation, about what you're doing to change the permitting regime or your monitoring of performance against licences?
I go. So the story of permitting is a difficult one for the agency. It had a genuine collapse in performance over the last 2 years, and lots of facts behind that. We had a range of staff move, and it's very technical work, and also we had a significant rise in applications as the economy reopened following COVID that I don't think were planned for or foreseen properly. And in the last year, we've been, frankly, throwing resources at it to try and recover the situation. We have recovered the situation to some degree. 80% of people get their permit on time currently. But scratch beneath the surface of those numbers and you'll see that actually for water in particular, where we have a lot of permit renewal work coming up, we're still struggling to get through the workload in a timely way. And one of the features of water that I have a lot of sympathy with the NGOs with is how many permits we have that are very aged, right back in some cases to the 1960s, and no longer reflect modernised environmental practices. And I've been looking at some of those personally. I can see the need for them to be rewritten. That is not a fast process. Now, I think there's a slight difference between that point and the point about whether we think the permits are set at the right level or calibrated appropriately. I mean, we have to apply the law as it is, not as some people may like it to be. And I think there's a debate to be had about whether the permit emission standards are tough enough. But we are applying the law, I think, fairly and accurately in our permits as they are being issued. There's then a question, which I know we'll come on to, about whether people inspect against the permits. So we're confident that water companies in particular are operating their installations in line with their permits, and we are not asleep at the wheel at all on that either. For the year ahead, we're trying to recover further our service standards, and there are 3 things we're doing on that. The first one is we're modernising the IT that underpins it. At the minute, there is no pre-application stage in the permit process, and we find that some applicants, particularly for more complicated schemes, do not provide adequate information for us to make a judgment. So we will have a pre-application checklist to make sure that the applications that come to the officers are actually in good shape. Secondly, we're going to maintain a high level of resourcing for the year ahead, which we'll have to recover in fees in subsequent years to make sure we catch up and maintain our flow of work. And thirdly, we're looking at whether we can standardise the publication of the permits and simplify them. I have heard from some water company executives, and I've got some sympathy with this point, that there are times where our permits are so complex it's actually very hard to know whether the installation is compliant or not because we put so many conditions on them. We do need to look very critically at what we're putting in permits to make sure we put the legally required numbers in and we don't overload the permitting system with a series of requirements that can't effectively be managed or monitored. So lots to do on permitting. There are also, of course, a number of permits coming through which are very complex schemes. We call these Category 5. These are the most complex schemes. For those, we are actually raising our income through the NSIP regime, and we'll have dedicated teams. So if you are working on a major rail, road scheme, energy scheme, you get dedicated service. That will make quite a big difference to getting those permits cleared. Our performance problem now is in the middle. It's the sort of central water company permits that we're lagging in.
Just in relation to your overall purpose of trying to protect the environment, do you regard yourselves as doing a good job, and how do you measure your performance?
Well, shall I start with I don't think we can say that we are doing a good job at the moment. I think that we have a lot to learn. I think we are improving in some areas significantly, and I think that within a measurable 3 or 4 year period, I think you will see us able to answer that question more positively. I think at the moment, how do we judge it? I mean, clearly we need to have better performance from the water companies in particular. That's very visible. But it's not just that. We need to do more on pollution from other sources, including agriculture and highways. And we can talk more about that. But that's the main one. There are equally some places where I think we are very good regulators. I think we do a good job on nuclear, for example, in conjunction with the other nuclear agencies. As Philip mentioned earlier, I think we generally are doing a good job on waste overall, although, again, it is a very difficult area, increasing in challenge as organised crime becomes more engaged in it. And we've got to keep going. We've got to keep improving to keep up. So inevitably it's patchy, but I think because water is not in a good shape at the moment, then I think our main emphasis has got to be on improvement there.
Go on to that. So, look, I think the agency's had a good end of year. You've got to remember that we've just gone through, pick your superlative. We have a very, very wet winter. We don't actually have completely parallel staff who deal with the floods. The people you're meeting in constituency are taken off other regulatory work. And they've been working as volunteers weekends and nights, week after week through the winter. And despite that, the focus we brought to performance across the executive team in the last year has driven up performance against our metrics. We have about 65 metrics in total for the agency. It's a big, complicated agency. This time last year, only 21% of them were green. Now 49% of them are green. This time last year, 55% of our metrics were red, not being met. Now 27% are red. Now, if you look at that 27% that are not being met, there are things of concern in there. I might highlight maintenance of flood assets, public safety reviews for locations, but there has been real progress on things like COMA, control of major accidents and hazards, 21% increase in output. That'll be green for the first year in 6 years. As I mentioned, progress on permitting and compliance. So we're building an agency that is more performative, that's focused on delivering its metrics. And I pay tribute to my staff who worked incredibly hard to get those numbers and get those results. As Alan says, we've got some structural problems. We're not approaching water regulation in the right way. Secondly, I don't think we've got the right evidence base and strategy to publish data that I think would support the effort more generally. And then there are issues around the regulation of waste and water and how we enforce against those things, which I think we do need to discuss. But I think there's some positive signs there. That performance improvement has not come about through any great transformation. We haven't transferred or put more resources in or changed how we do it. It's come about because we've just stayed very focused on it. And one thing we're quite keen to do next year, and where we're going to try and publish a business plan that covers this, is agree with the Secretary of State a series of much more meaningful metrics about whether you can say this agency is performing. So currently, for example, in our headline metrics, there isn't really anything that covers whether water industry permits are compliant or not, which is an obvious thing to ask. That needs to change. So we're going to try and evolve that a bit so we've got a set of targets we can work to. But I think people are up for it in the agency. They want to be more forward-leaning, and they want to be delivering for the public. So if we get those metrics right, I'm confident we can move the dial.
That's sort of at the heart of the OEP investigation, isn't it? The whether you're monitoring against the permits from the overflows. Because that investigation is happening, is that led you proactively, before it concludes, to review what you're doing and change the way you're doing things?
Honestly, it's not because of the OEP investigation. It's because anyone who comes into a job like this will be focused on water quality. I mean, let's just comment on where we started. So, 91 staff in an agency of nearly 13,400 who were qualified to do water inspections. And yet, this is the top priority issue, well, certainly in my inbox, maybe in yours as well. A withdrawal successively in 2009 and then again in 2015 from regular investigations into compliance. Previously, there were only 900 inspections of water installations. There are 16,000 regulated installations.
By 91 people?
By 91 people. Last year we did 1,420, so an improvement. And if you look at monitoring, we significantly reduced the level of monitoring we were doing against the Water Framework Directive, partly because of budgetary constraints. So we're starting on the back foot. And I'm very pleased to say we've had a lot of support from the government in turning that round. And if I may, I might say a bit about how we're approaching that. I mean, there's three big things we need to do. So firstly, we need to make sure we've got good enough data that is published and widely available. Secondly, we need to do more than 1,400 inspections, and We've agreed with the Secretary of State at our request. He has agreed to increase our fees, and we will have 500 qualified water inspectors appointed in the course of this year. We will do 4,000 inspections this calendar year. We'll do over 10,000 the following year. Our intention is to publish those inspections, just as our peer regulators in Wales and Scotland do. And we will use that to drive a much more risk-based approach about whether the water companies are abiding by their obligations and delivering what they've said they would do. And as you know, we're in the middle of this price review. I think a big question is making sure the water companies do deliver the investment which they have agreed to do with our colleagues in Ofwat. We should come on to the water industry later on, but no doubt. But that is a start of a real change of gear from the agency and the focus we put on water. It isn't going to be an instant change, but if we had this conversation in a year's time, you'd have a lot more evidence in front of you about how the industry is performing than you currently do.
I'm sure the successor committee will have a conversation like this in a year's time. Duncan Beckett.
Thank you. I represent Norfolk, and that's got a heavy chunk of the Broads in it. Yes. So I can certainly reiterate what the Chair has just said, that my constituency had huge amounts of flooding from the Norfolk Broads, and the EA have been excellent over the last few months, and that includes the Area Director, Graham Verrier, who has, and multiple officers who came to an open public meeting that I held, and so they have been extremely helpful, so thank you for that. I just want to move on to particularly how the sort of goals are aligned between the Environment Agency and the government's objectives, and just see how strategically they fit together and marry up, and how effectively, therefore, that is also reviewed and managed. So therefore, to what extent does the government's Environment Improvement Plan 2023 underpin the agency's own goals? How do they fit and marry up together?
Yeah, we have... sorry, did you finish?
Yes.
We have certainly sought to ensure that our principal objectives are directly aligned with the EIP. We are very conscious that progress against the EIP is not where it should be. The OEP has been clear on that, and we need to play our part in doing something about that. But certainly in each of our fundamental corporate scorecard elements are all mapped against relevant sections of the EIP, and we care deeply.
How do you deal with the differences between government plans and Environment Agency plans? So, for instance, over air quality, for instance, where there's differences between, and how do you, what sort of processes are there behind the scenes that try to align those to government plans and to your plans?
Yeah, okay. Do on it. Yeah.
We have a very good relationship with DEFRA. We have various, joint committees that look at these areas. I think we're pretty well aligned on the goals. There are times they have different perspective about what can be done on the cost of doing things to us. We give them technical advice on those areas. But if you take waste, for example, which is a huge part of the plan, and then we've got the waste resources plan, we're currently doing 13 separate projects on waste to help the government deliver its vision for waste. It's an extremely radical vision they have for waste, and those projects are complicated, and they're not straightforward to deliver, but I think there is a good degree of alignment between those areas. Biodiversity net gain be another one, chemicals regulation be another one. So I would say our policy partnership with DEFRA and other departments, DESNES as well, is pretty strong right now, and I don't see much evidence of us sort of being at sixes and sevens on issues.
How does the, despite me being very complimentary about my regional team, and I genuinely mean that, who gives you oversight and regulates that you are performing to the appropriate sort of levels? If I have a particular grievance with the EA locally, and I say from flooding could be at one level, extremely, I could be pleased about. I could be dealing with a constituent. I had a case recently, gentleman wanted to try to remove invasive species from a river system, and the EA are absolutely not interested in supporting and helping him at all. I've got no route to complain about that process or what I felt was a wrong decision. How do I go about doing that so that, where is the oversight mechanism of your work?
Combination of internally from our board, as you'd expect, from DEFRA and from the OEP. But if there are issues where you think we're not doing the right thing, feel free. I will be always happy to. Of course, you can come to me and or to Philip, and we will do our best. Is all I can say.
And who has oversight then above the Environment Agency? Because with the greatest respect, often a board will protect its own employees.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty robust board, but I take the point. But clearly, the OEP is our formal regulator, and we are also subject. I have my appraisal with the Secretary of State next week on performance over the last year. So I think those are the three elements.
This is a warm-up tickle then to what you've next week. Okay, and then look. Lastly, when will you be providing an update then? On the EA's achievement of its 2022-23 targets under EA 2025?
We aim to publish a business plan the next month. That will include the outcome of the targets performance last year.
23-24.
There's only one metric we haven't yet resolved, which is waiting for the last journals of the finance, but we are almost there.
Chair?
Thank you, Duncan. Shelley McCrory.
Thank you, Chair. If I can open the questioning on water quality and water quality monitoring, if I can. And if I start with a general question on how will monitoring of storm overflows and emergency overflows be conducted under the Environment Act requirements that you now have?
Environment 2021 provides for obligatory monitoring publication. It's a slightly strangely worded act in that I think Clause 83 actually provides for the water companies to publish the data rather than the Environment Agency, which is, I don't quite know what's done like that. There's no reason why we can't scrape that material to our own systems, but they are doing the publication, not us in first instance. Now, it's just worth taking a little step back and contextualising what we need to do with this data. Firstly, because a storm overflow in itself is not necessarily unlawful. Because there are conditions for excessive weather, rain and snowmelt where that would be lawful. And actually, just the raw data doesn't show whether we would regard that as a breach or not, because flow-through times between heavy rain and when we would allow an overflow vary around the country based on the system. So there's not one easy answer to whether a particular overflow is lawful or unlawful in the current legal framework. One of the things that campaigners have challenged the regulators on, which I think is right, is clarity on when do we start looking in more detail at a particular overflow. And the current threshold for that is 60 spills a year, which is the Wastewater Treatment Directive threshold. That reduces to 50 in year 2 and 40 in year 3, and we're working with DEFRA to see whether, and Ofwat, to see whether those are still appropriate thresholds for investigation in future. So that data will be made, it is already available. It'll be available in near real time shortly via water company publication. We are collaborating quite well with Water UK on how that data should be made available, making sure it is genuinely transparent, reliable, interoperable. I think for users of the data, they want to be able to put that data next to our inspections and other data so they get a complete picture.
I think for members of the public, they just want to have one transparent place that they can go, that they can rely on, which, sometimes it's campaigners, sometimes but it's certainly not the water company, sadly, but potentially it could be you. So how can you help manage that so that, if you go to a bathing beach, you know that you're going to see accurate data, and I'll come on to what that data says in just a second.
Okay. I'd encourage everyone to have a look at what we did with the data we published recently on last year's overflow data, because that was mapped to quite a high degree of definition, so you can see your local area, where the regulations are. If you click through on the particular asset, you will see the number of spills, when they took place and frequency. You'll also see information like who owns the asset, what the permit number is, what's permitted under the permits. You've got much more granularity information. Now, I think we should overlay more information on that.
Yeah. What kind of information?
Well, for example, could we combine that with near-to-real-time reporting on overflows, for example? Could we put more data on these inspections we're taking for? Could you see those on the data? You've got that picture. Could you combine that with data on bathing water information? So how much in one place could we achieve to give, I entirely agree with your vision for how we do that. That's actually not far away from where Natural Resources Wales are, and I think that's a much better system for transparency. So that's where I'd like us to get to in the future.
Do you have the capability to be able to tell people what's in the water in real time? Is that, even though it might not be widespread yet, is it there? Because at the moment, when people see the headlines of a storm overflow, we get rain. So I'm a Cornish constituent, Cornish MP, and my constituents will see every time it rains, then they tend not to go to the beach because they know that it's going to be some kind of sewage overflow. However, having done a lot of work around this, we know that 95% of it is rainwater or runoff. It's not raw sewage. There's only 5% is going to be raw sewage. But people don't know that. And so how can you help make that data transparent so that people can see actually what it is that they're potentially going to be bathing in?
I think, if I may, I might split your question to two, because there's a set of issues there about monitoring and about bathing water, and they are a little bit different. On monitoring, this is a programme which has been cut back considerably in recent years. I think I'm right in saying that we're only doing about a third of the Water Framework Directive monitoring checks we were doing 4 years ago. And that worries me. I think that's not right. I can't see who else can provide this information apart from the EA. So I think we need to think about the prioritisation of this within our programme. A lot of those databases are not the kind of thing we publish in real time because they're actually ecological studies about invertebrate numbers, seasonal pollution cycles for river health. So they're not that sort of information. No reason why you can't publish that information in a map form as well. Some of the things we are monitoring, for example, in the Lake District, we have real-time sondes in the watercourse, so they're looking at levels of pollutant and NMP, and you could publish that in real time, but that's a different set of issues. On bathing water, there's been a lot of controversy recently about this, and I think we should just, if I may just explain our thinking about it. So, we follow the bathing water regulations. They're built on the EU Bathing Water Directive. It's transposed into UK law, so we do it in exactly the same way as our peer regulators across Europe. We talked to them about how they've done it. And a big area of controversy is our models we do. We model potential turbidity or poor bathing water quality on days where there has been bad weather, storm, very heavy rain. Now, to be clear, that is modelled. So that is not the same as saying there has been a sewage pollution. That's not what we're saying at all. The methodology for that, it has been challenged. It was challenged by Anglia Water in court. It's been looked at by the EU. I think it's a very good methodology. We're pretty confident in it. But like all models, it has to be open for conversation and for scientific rigour. And for example, some pressure groups, Surfers Against Sewage, for example, they think we undersell the pollution risk. But there is a counter-argument, which is we're putting out warnings for bathing waters on the basis of model weather conditions. And that may look to the public like a pollution incident. It's not a pollution incident. It's a model of a storm or high flow. Now, it probably does correlate to high levels of turbidity and runoff, which can include E. coli from farms, for example. We have tried to make that clearer on Swimfo, our website. We are, under the directive, required to alert swimmers to days where there could be poor bathing water quality. So we are doing what the regulation says, but obviously it's not the same as saying that is definitely pollution. So you're absolutely right about that. I think this debate is quite tricky for us. We're very happy to have scrutiny of our modelling or how we publish that information. I don't think it's personally trying to be too leading either direction, trying to plot a midpoint in those areas. All I would say is there's good evidence that when there has been heavy rain or a storm, the water may be more polluted. That's a reasonable point to make for the public. And certainly if I go swimming in the sea, I do check Swimfo and see whether we've got an alert out, because it's telling me something useful I wouldn't necessarily know.
So that's all very helpful, and I think if I go back to the monitoring side of it, because so the beach I'm visualising is actually where Surfers Against Sewage is based in my constituency, and it has got a South West Water asset on it, which contributes a lot of the time to the overflow, but it isn't the whole story. So whereas the campaigners will see it as a potential Southwest Water problem, and it's an easy target to go after that, and I wouldn't potentially stop them from doing that if that's the right thing to do, but also there's an awful lot of runoff that comes on, and I'm just giving one example. And what the rest of my constituents want to see is transparent, factual data that doesn't lean one side or the other, but just we can all see what's what.
It's Porthtowan, is it?
No, it's St Agnes.
Okay. Because I was in Porthtowan doing a sample myself last year.
Look,
what our scientists say is that, particularly looking for human pathogens like E. coli, you're looking in seawater, I think rivers is a different matter, but in seawater, those pathogens can be quite hard to find even after a spill or a wash-off, and they don't necessarily last particularly long in the watercourse. Not surprising, it's a large amount of water, it's high levels of UV, the water itself in Cornwall is very clean as it comes from the Gulf Stream, so I understand why that is the case. So they worry about the position taken by some lobbyists and Surfers Against Sewage about saying, well, there's 2 days' worth of beach closure here. Yeah. I don't think the evidence supports that necessarily. Now, we are not taking, to be clear, the sort of regularity of sampling at these beaches that would enable us to see day after day how the E. coli levels were changing. We're not funded to do that. It's not our requirement. Obviously, we could put more money into it if we had more money, and we could spend more on doing daily or hourly monitoring, but we don't currently have that. And our current procedure for human pathogens is to collect water, we take it to labs overnight with quite a high level of rigour. Our labs are in Exeter for Cornwall, and it isn't practical for us to do more regular monitoring. So there is an interplay between this modelling and our monitoring levels. We are trying to have a dialogue with the NGOs about the underlying science here. I'm personally very sceptical that this 2-day principle that's against sewage have advocated is right, and trying to make sure when we're communicating what we are saying, and we're saying there's been a storm today, you may have turbidity in the water, which is a more accurate way of putting it.
So if we were to recommend, so I'll be finished just saying, if we were going to make a recommendation to Secretary of State about funding for such a real-time testing, particularly in the bathing waters, is that a realistic ambition to get to with extra funding, or is it just something that you say, well, we can't do because we need the funding, but actually even if we gave you the funding, you still couldn't do it? Is it a realistic ambition if it isn't?
Well, look, we spend nearly 70 million a year on monitoring, but we have cut back considerably on some areas of monitoring for budgetary constraints. I don't think it's a secret that money is tight across all the public sector, and this would be revenue spending. Not obvious we can recoup it from fees either. So I think ministers have to think quite hard about how they would trade that off against other pressures they'd be facing. I'd also say that the monitoring has to be done at quite a high level of rigour. And there are questions about ongoing lab space, for example. But to give you a sense of scale of the money we'd need, to put back the Water Framework Directive cuts is about 4 million a year. But this year we'll face about 9 million a year of pressure just from inflation. And that's the cost of fuel to drive things to and from our labs. It's the cost of lab space. It's an expensive thing to do to monitor on that level of regularity. And we're not doing nutrient monitoring or chemical monitoring where we can have a sonde in the watercourse. We're actually doing a test for human pathogens. So it's a more complex thing to do to monitor a bathing water than it would be for pollution from a wastewater treatment plant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kat Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about any new monitoring instruments that have been certified, and just to sort of reassure the committee that maybe you're not locked into using old technology?
No, we're not. We're thinking quite hard about how we can modernise our monitoring. I think, may I say 3 things about monitoring that I think are difficult. The first one is, this is particularly in the water domain, a particularly sensitive debate, and so even choices about what you monitor become very controversial. And we're currently debating things like phosphorus levels with a number of NGOs. And that's not because we have a plan to reduce monitoring, it's because we're trying to work out what the current market can offer on phosphorus monitoring. Is that the right? So that's the first thing that makes it quite challenging. Secondly, we are bringing in more automated monitoring, including remote monitoring we can put into watercourses. We're being driven to that by DEFRA because actually they want in future to make sure that upstream and downstream from regulated water treatment plants we have nutrient monitoring, which we could map and share in real time. So we're looking at that. And we're pretty active on the market, seeing what's out there, both with water companies and in air quality, to see if there are products. What I think is difficult for us is making sure that any new models we bring are quality assured, and that the supply chain is good enough to make sure that the numbers we're giving are accurate. And we have seen in the last year, particularly in the domain of air quality, real problems in getting standardisation and calibration right for some of these monitors. So we're a bit nervous about rushing too quickly to bring in technology we haven't had properly assured.
Can I just pick you up on that, Kat? Sorry to interrupt for a moment, but very specifically on that. I've been approached by a whistleblower who is concerned about the technology that is being tested precisely for the reasons that you've described, to ensure that there's a proper QA and that the capability works, but that this is in relation to the precisely what you're talking about, the near real-time monitoring of the four parameters that were consulted on by DEFRA following the Environment Act into water quality, and the allegation is that I think Atkins you're using to advise on this and to undertake the equipment testing, but they are being steered towards a single capability, a single supplier, and not allowing innovation to be available to the water companies to use for the sondes that are out there. I don't really expect you to know about that over this session, but if you do know about it, perhaps you could respond. If you don't, perhaps you could look into it and write back to me about it.
Very happy to look into it. I mean, I think there's a balance, isn't there, between allowing innovation from the market, lots of different sorts of monitors, and making sure that all the monitors are proven to deliver a common standard of reading. That is the kind of balance I think we have to strike, but I'm very happy to look at the particular issue there.
In a lot of your answers, you've talked about the near real-time monitoring data. How do you envisage that being used by the EA, and who do you expect to be accessing this? Is it going to be the public, regulators, and or the water industry?
I think it's all of them.
Yeah. And how will they use them differently, and how do you envisage it looking in terms of from a user end?
Well, I guess the question for most people who are in the public or in campaigners looking at this is that they're worried about so-called dry spills. They want to match the weather to what they're seeing in terms of the spill data. And we share that aspiration. So this debate can be very heated, but the truth is that the focus that a lot of citizens, scientists and campaigners have brought to water quality is what raises up the agenda. And I think many people in the agency who spent years working on water quality are very grateful for efforts made to raise this up the agenda. So I think you have to have a shared view of those areas. I think there is a genuine question for us all about what we will do if we see significant non-compliance, because there will be limits on how often we can enforce, there will be limits on how often we can prosecute. We have to be realistic about that. But the water companies, certainly those I talk to, in the main, are very committed to getting that feedback on where they're seeing spills and fixing it. And obviously that's a principal issue in the price review process. But having a platform where you can see it in real time and you can map it, I think is really, really critical for everybody.
I suppose that really leads to the question, are we looking at open source data that the public and campaigners will be able to pull out and be able to use to manipulate themselves in order to cross-match it potentially with things like weather events?
Yeah.
Open source
well,
data?
My view on the matter is that ARHUS principles obligate us to publish as much as possible as an environmental regulator, and therefore I can't really see why you wouldn't make public this information. There is a counter-argument, and I hear it from some of the water companies, which says, well, it'll be misused. People will say, this water company is working illegally, and it's untrue because actually their spill of sewage is completely compliant with the regulations. I hear that argument, but surely the way to deal with that argument is to have that debate rather than not provide the data in the first place. And I think, a mature way of taking the argument forward is to have that data about everybody, and then we'll work through allegations as they come in.
Is that a commitment from the Environment Agency to work constructively then with citizen analysis, that if it was to suggest that there had been a deficiency in enforcement?
Yes, we'd work constructively with them on that basis. I think we're working pretty well with citizen scientists and campaigners up and down the country, many of whom have taught us a few things. We've no monopoly on wisdom in the Environment Agency, and we need to listen to what people are saying to us about our operations. Are we asking for the right things in the right way? I'd like to slightly make that more of a partnership and less oppositional, and I've asked some of the campaigners whether they come and talk to our new inspectors, whether they'd share their perspectives on what they think we should be doing, whether they'd share tips they see from the data. And also I've had the benefit of data releases from a number of campaigners and retired academics who sent me, I think, very interesting analysis of the data. That is all for the good. It helps us with our investigations. So I don't think we need to be defensive about that. We need to get the data out there and get that dialogue going.
The government has set a target that water companies eliminate adverse ecological impact from sewage discharges at all sensitive sites by 2035 and at all other overflows by 2050. Is that something that the EA monitors? And I just wondered how you were determining what an adverse ecological impact is.
Well, it would depend on the site. So at the minute our focus is the Water Framework Directive, and in particular the 2027 non-deterioration clauses of the Water Framework Directive. That's the first milestone we have to meet under legislation. There's then a question of prioritising investment in storm overflows, and it will take investment to fix those overflows. And we are working with our colleagues in Ofwat on prioritising which overflows should be targeted first. Why might you target an overflow? Because it touches on a SSSI or an SAC, or because you're particularly concerned about the very high level of nutrients it puts into an overall catchment. So not all overflows are the same. Some of them are higher risk and lower risk. I think that's a sensible way of looking at the problem and prioritising the work. Because the cost is extremely high, we're going to have to make some choices. That's not only about money and bills, it's also about delivery capability and what can be done by the water companies to make these investments over that time. So we're trying to pick our way through that. It's also worth saying that between now and 2035, a lot of the critical deadlines in the Water Framework Directive come true. So I've mentioned 2027, which is the non-deterioration clause. Then we have the requirement to reduce abstraction to maintain good ecological status, which comes in 2030. So right now the task for us is to work out what must be done in what order for the water companies to meet those deadlines as they come up.
And are you confident of meeting the deadlines?
Honestly, I worry that we have a small number of water companies now who are significantly behind on their AMP7, that's the current price review, PR19 work. That is a pretty unprecedented situation. I don't think the agency's been in that situation before, where we've had water companies who have not delivered things they said they would do in PR19. And that means that they're at significant risk of missing the deadlines for the non-deterioration Water Framework Directive measures. I guess the question then is, what do we do as a regulator about that? And the truth of the matter is that those water companies, and I've been very transparent with them all about that, they will face enforcement action after 2027. They need to make sure they have met those targets. Shortly after that, of course, we then get further deadlines, although they normally come about through reduction in abstraction permits for the 2030 period. So that's going to be very challenging for the sector to do that in those companies. All that said, many companies are doing really very well on PR19, so it's a mixed picture.
Would you like to perhaps name any of the companies that you're particularly concerned about?
I don't think I need to.
I think our EPA announcement in July will give a pretty clear view that there are, in a sense, two tiers of water companies at the moment, and that will give very good reading to that answer.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we've got just a little over half an hour left, and we've got at least 6 sets of questions, so if we can try and keep ourselves to 5 minutes each set. Chris Grayling.
So I'm worried about the comment that you made about the need for sometimes you can take action, sometimes not. My very direct experience of the organisation, from the point of view of my constituency, is that you are, as an organisation, very, very, very ineffective at enforcement. And that it is very easy for a rogue operator to run rings around your team. And if the word from the boss is not, we have to be tough and deter, we will instead, we won't always be able to take action, then those rogue operators are going to run rings around you still.
Well, I think since I've been in this role, I have taken a much more forward-leaning view on enforcement, particularly in the waste industry, and we've issued some suspensions. They have proven very effective. I mean, I think your criticism has some truth to it, because in one case, we were dealing with an operator that had been in band F, so the lowest level of compliance, for several years. When we suspended, we found they quickly moved to comply with their permit conditions. I've also said, and I'll repeat it here, that a suspension is a journey. Just because you comply with the suspension doesn't mean we wipe the slate clean and forget your previous non-compliance. The agency has never closed a waste site. It's never used the EPA in that way. Now, the good reason not to do that is that is a risky thing to do. You should do it only when you've exhausted all other options. But my message to you is that if we do have very non-compliant businesses who, even after suspension, are still not complying, then we will consider not only prosecution but closure orders. And I hope you'll recognise that's a distinct change of tone from the agency. So far, in the agency, that's gone quite well for us, because in the 3 most difficult waste sites we've suspended recently, we've seen a boost in compliance that's been almost immediate. I also think there's a question for the agency about legal risk. The agency is very proud that it wins almost 100% of its court cases. I have to question whether that's too many.
But that's a point I would really pick up, and this applies to water enforcement, it applies to waste enforcement. I've had all the way through dealing with the agency over 3 years of a major problem, that behind a small number of frontline staff who clearly want to do the right thing, there are a team of lawyers going, oh, this is all a bit risky. And you are strong enough and muscular enough, and actually more so than small local authorities, to really put the boot into rogue operators, whether it's in water or waste or elsewhere. But my sense of the organisation is just too timid to do it. And your point about legal risk is, I think, absolutely the heart of it. Unless you're absolutely 100% certain that you're going to win, that it's clear cut, you do have the power to rewrite permits unilaterally in cases where an operator of whatever sort is behaving in a way that is unacceptable. But it doesn't happen. And I think the reason it doesn't happen is because of that legal risk point.
I think, as you say, frontline staff in the agency, they want to do the right thing for the community. They live in the community, in the main, so they understand why a site is problematic. Of course, as a regulator, we want to be fair, transparent, well evidence-based. We don't want to make capricious legal decisions, particularly in litigious areas like water and waste. But you are right, there is a risk that people regard their permit conditions as being optional, because in practice nothing would happen if they didn't meet them. They are not optional, they are obligatory. And there are consequences for not meeting them. Not only personal consequences in terms of risk of prosecution, but also the risk your business will be suspended till you comply with them, or closed if you still don't comply with them. That is, of course, how Parliament conceived the EPR regulations. That isn't how they have lived recently. So I think hopefully I can give you some reassurance that is the mindset we're taking. Internally, that means we have to have better conversations about risk as a regulator. Whether are we prepared for the day we may lose a court case, and for the blowback we may get in that situation. And does the chief executive support staff who might be taking those risks?
Because I think, if you look at, so there were 15,000 apparent breaches on the waterfront last year. I don't know how many of them were actually permit breaches. It'd be useful to know that. But if you have got a situation where you cannot possibly take action, of all the 15,000, probably only a relatively small number are actionable, but if you're only not taking action robustly when a situation arises, then, and even if it's just a warning letter that goes across, what happens is the operator calms down for a bit and then they start again.
Yeah, if I may, we need to use the full panoply of enforcement measures, and in some cases that will be letters, but also we are delighted with the removal of the cap on variable monetary penalties, and certainly a request to us in due course is to enable us to apply the civil standard of justice of balance of probability, which is what Ofwat have for those penalties, as opposed to the beyond reasonable doubt. That would make for much quicker and effective enforcement, and I think would make a material change. Then we would carry forward a smaller number of issues where we believe that prosecution is appropriate, and we will investigate those properly. But I do think that we need to use the range. Clearly, we are absolutely set on doing so.
Do you think you have sufficient power to rewrite permits in cases where you feel that the conditions attached to the permit are not strong enough to deal with the behaviour of the organisation you're dealing with?
A permit isn't normally about behaviour. It can be about behaviour in terms of driving. We do have good powers to rewrite them. We have to make sure we're applying the law about their particular behaviour. So there are limits on what we can do, and we have communities who complain about things like lorry movements and noise, and often they're not really permittable issues. Ventilation is, for example, in a waste site. I mean, just to build on what the Chair was saying, I think this is really important. So our lack of ability to make swift decisions at the civil justice level does make us less effective, because having to do everything under PACE 84 is a very bureaucratic and very expensive way of doing it. Of course, it's completely appropriate for criminal prosecutions, but not necessarily for strict liability environmental offending. And it's that means you have this very long time lag between the offending taking place and a penalty. Now, waste is slightly different, because we have actually, this year, with our partners in the NCA and with HMRC, we're exploring a much wider range of interventions on waste crime, including travel bans, POCA and asset seizures. Actually, turns out we've got quite a lot of things we could do that would make quite a big difference there. But I think for corporate offending, we are too slow, and in part that is because we're working at this criminal threshold, which is a very, very slow process to bring a prosecution against a company. And I entirely feel the frustration of people in communities who were told this could take years, and of course we have to get court slot for those cases, and the courts have got other things on their in tray. So there is an issue there I think we need to resolve.
So can I ask you,
Final question.
In the constituency case, to look at the emboldening your team to rewrite permits?
I will look at your constituency case.
The point of view of the team is, just a quick one to put on the record, of the 15,000 storm overflows in breach that we've had in the past 12 months. Do you know how many were actually in breach of permit conditions?
No. It would be we are going to look, and we are looking in this operation standard, at how one combines the millions of bits of data we have. I mean, actually billions, over 2 billion in operation standard for 1 year. You have to combine meteorology, flow pattern, and permit to understand whether that is lawful or not. Another way of looking at it is how many permits spill more than 60 times a year, and which ones should be targeted and prioritised. That's a slightly easier way of looking at it, and that's what we're doing in the price review.
Thank you, Chris. Barry Garner.
I wanted to ask you about adaptation and your role there, because the EA has an important role to play in delivering the third National Adaptation Programme. So, Mr. Duffy, could you just set out for us the 5 key areas where it says that action is required?
Well, there are rather more than 5 in the NAP which cover us.
There are 5 key areas as they set it out.
So, where to start? Let's start with water management first of all. And there is a quite well joined up architecture to look at adaptation planning under the plan. And in particular, there is a question for the agency about how far it wants to lean into not only our traditional pluvial and coastal flooding issues, but also surface water flooding and summer flooding. And we are taking a slightly more forward-leaning approach on that. We have opened new advisory services to local authorities on it. We're being quite proactive on that. Second area is really about improving the planning process. We share the concern that's listed in the NAP about the quality and calibre of planning for infrastructure, and whether there are particular areas of infrastructure that are critically at risk from further climate change. The obvious case is rail, but actually energy is taking quite a lot of our time right now, and citing the energy plants, whether we're happy with the enhanced grid. Nature is obviously quite important, more than quite important.
Well, that, we're the first one that you've got that correlates with one of their 5, yes.
Right.
I mean, they've set out the 5 as infrastructure, natural environment, health, communities and built environment included in that, business and industry, and international dimensions.
Yeah.
So,
what's your question?
well, my first question was, what are they? Because if you don't know what they are, then it's very difficult to know how you're actually contributing to them. So that was the first question. The next question would be, the Committee on Climate Change told us that we actually lack the framework to track adaptation and climate change risk. And that is hampering the ability to monitor the progress and to drive delivery. So the next question is, what are the frameworks that you want to put in place in order to do that currently are lacking?
I'll do my best. I don't quite answer the question, but let me start by trying to answer. I think you're asking me about whether we know about adaptation risk. Is that a question?
Well, the Committee on Climate Change said that we lacked the frameworks with which to assess it. So, given that was their criticism, I wanted to know how you're addressing that and what frameworks you believe we need to put in place, or indeed since then, because that was, I think, in July last year when they said that, what frameworks you have now put in place that give you a better understanding of how to track the adaptation and climate change risk.
So, we've spoken to the CCC quite regularly, and our major contribution to understanding that risk, which we share with them and they use in their reports, is our modelling on flood risk, which is called NAPFA, and that will be republished this year as NAPFA 2. NAPFA 2 is a much more sophisticated study than NAPFA originally was, and it will provide down to 2 metre by 2 metre squared modelling, a map that covers rain risk allied to the CCC's work on future climate scenarios, coastal risk that is also mapped along those scenarios, offers groundwater flooding risk, which is a particularly difficult area to model for local government, and provides both depth of water and speed of water modelling in those areas. That is a very major undertaking. It is due to be published in October of this year, and I think it will put quite a new colour on the matter, because it will signal to many communities that maybe are not aware they're at significant risk of climate change, that they are actually facing very significant risks. And it will highlight in particular in urban areas how much work we have to do on surface water and summer flooding, because it will show those locations where you could get very serious risks. Now, obviously, it is harder to forecast storm cells compared with frontal rainfall, but that will give a signal to local government about those areas. Now, next question is, what do we do about that? What the agency has traditionally done is it's done a study for the government of what you would need to invest to maintain a constant level of risk to households and businesses, given the CCC's view of the evolving climate risk. When we last did this, it was ahead of the last spending review. We said it was about £1 billion a year, and that was very much the funding we got from the government for our current programme. So that's the main thing. I'm not aware in the agency we're doing any modelling on health. It has come up before, where we should do some look at extreme heat, for example. We are discussing with the UK HSA whether there's a work programme we should take forward together on heat, as they normally lead on the health issues. Does that help?
It does. Certainly the framework that you identified on that will improve the understanding of flooding resilience and inundation is one. Let me challenge you though on because you outlined the increase in your performance in areas earlier in your remarks, but in terms of adaptation. You've gone from 96% of actions that were on track in Q4 last year to 80% of them being on track this year. Why has adaptation suffered in that way? What are the problems that you've encountered that have not kept those things on track?
Yes, I was looking at before I came to this committee, actually. I mean, it's quite an interesting work programme that my predecessor established, a very comprehensive work programme. If you look at those 96 items, A lot of them are about internal processes. So they're about making sure, for example, that when we are doing a flood scheme, we are taking into account of adaptation risk. Or when we're doing a regulatory decision, we're doing that. There are bits of guidance on that. There are some training issues. I'm told that we're going to be below 80% at the end of the year. 78% is the number I have in mind for the end of the year, which won't be great, but we're only 2 below. Frankly, it's just been resources, and in some areas it's been we're dependent on other bits of technical analysis for it. It is a good, robust programme to raise our capability internally on those areas. So you're completely right to raise it. I am told that in Q1 of next year, we will catch up considerably on the remaining outstanding items on that work programme.
Thank you. In 2021, the publication that you put out on adaptation, you said that regulation is not yet ready for a changing climate. Is it now? And what progress do you think has been made to get regulation ready for a changing climate?
Yeah. Only very partly is it ready, I would say. So we have just gone through a cycle of looking in water, in particular, at the future water resource management plans. We published a summary of the plans that Ofwat are currently considering last month. It's well worth reading because it's from that we get this number of nearly 5 billion litres a day that we think will be short by 2050. Dig into those numbers a little bit and you find that what's driving that is not so much population growth or business growth, although it does drive some of that. It's actually the choice we face as a country about whether we can continue to abstract so much water from chalk streams and aquifers, and that drives about 2/3 of that number, nearly 3 billion. And that's mainly in eastern England and southeast England. And that is an example of, do you want to confront that choice? Because the measures you would need to take to confront that choice are expensive. And we detail in that publication all of the investments we think you would need to do to close that 5 billion litre a day gap. And you'll all have heard of some of these schemes. Some that are very controversial, some less so. Abingdon, Wisbech, Teddington. You would probably have to do most of them to close that gap. And that's a great example of is regulation thinking about the reality of living in a world which is hotter and where in summer in particular those levels of abstraction would no longer be tenable. And that's just to give one example in one domain.
Thank you. And Mr. Lovell, I know you want to come in there. I just want, because this committee is focused on recommendations to government, what are the recommendations that you believe should follow that this committee could make that would improve that situation? And if I can try and lead the witness, what sort of need is there for government to be clear about priorities?
I'm happy to have a go at that, if I may, because I'm delighted we've got on to water resources, which is the thing that we are and should be, I think, most worried about. And and certainly a proper long-term plan for water resources is a fundamental requirement for government, in my opinion. I think that on flood, we have a 50-year plan. I think we have done good work under the various innovation programs and on shoreline management, and particularly on estuaries, Thames 2100 and the Humber. So on flood, I think actually we are relatively well positioned for adaptation. But on resources, there is a long way to go. We all are familiar with the fact that the last new reservoir to be built in this country was 1991. That doesn't feel right, and more needs to be done. I think that the Thames Tideway has been a very interesting model in financing terms, as well as a well-constructed model, and that's certainly something that should be looked at for further investment in that field.
Give me some solid recommendations.
I mean, let me go at this. We are supportive of most of the measures in the water resource management plans. Some of them we have pushed back on for ecological reasons, and that is only right. But actually, it is time to get on with constructing, as the chairman has said, many of these reservoirs across the piece. And that would be a core recommendation.
And if I may just add, if there is to be any reduction in the current business plans for the next 5 years, the next from the water companies, it should not be in the field of water resources.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you. I just want to ask some questions around staffing matters and staffing issues. And I just wanted you, if you could just start by just reminding us what are your staffing levels are at the moment, and levels of retentions and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. I'll make a start, and again, Philip will pick up. First thing to say, I think, is that the full-time equivalent numbers have increased by 2,000 during my 18 months in office, from about 11,400 to 13,400. I think that has been very appropriate, mostly covered by under the spending review of 2021, but that's included extra people administering a bigger flood programme. It's involved the recruitment of people for agricultural regulation, and also an increase to permitting, amongst other things. And we have got to a level, let me be clear about this, where we think broadly we can do the job. Now, we are about to set out, and indeed have started and have made a very good start, on recruiting people for enhanced water regulation, water industry regulation, and we'll be looking to take on 600 people over the next 15 months for that. But we also feel that there are opportunities for increasing the efficiency of the organisation, which will cover roughly an approximate number by natural wastage over that time. So I think that we are at approximately the level of employment that we should be at. We have a remarkable fact of the agency is how long people stay. They are tremendously loyal. It has dropped a little bit, but we are still at an average of over 15 years. Turnover is relatively low. It's sat between about 4 and 6% over the past 3 years, and the other thing I would say is that in making this recruitment and retention effort, we have centralised more of our recruitment. That's also enabled us to do to focus on a more balanced workforce. We have given good focus to minority ethnicity and have improved the position there quite considerably, and we aim to continue that.
Can I just ask some specifics? I think in February 2023, when you reported to this committee, you said that retention levels have been affected by salary levels in real terms decreasing by 20%. What progress has been made in this area to address this?
So I'll answer that.
Yeah.
So you're right. In 2021, our turnover was 3.9%, and it rose to 6.1% in the following year, 21-22. And last year was 5.6%. We entered a prolonged period of both industrial dispute and negotiation on pay with the government last year, which we very much regretted. And in particular, we were on a work to rule where a lot of our staff would not volunteer to do out-of-hours response to flood risk. They're not obliged under their contracts, so they weren't. I'm very pleased to say that the Prime Minister agreed our pay remit, which enabled us to increase our pay bill by about 1.35%. We targeted that pay increase on the areas we were struggling most to recruit, our lowest paid staff who work in the field, and many of whom you'll have seen in your constituencies, and certain specialists, particularly mechanical and electrical engineering, where we were really struggling to recruit. And we have actually seen a modest drop in turnover. I would say in general, since the economy reopened, turnover has been quite high, but currently our turnover is only 5.4%, which I think is pretty reasonable.
It's a healthy level. I think that's absolutely fine.
Okay, and you've just indicated that your average tenure of agency. Is that 15 years, or has that
Right,
changed in the last...
am I right? Sorry, 11. Has it come
It's
down
dropped to 11. It's 11.4
it was 15.
years.
It's dropped to 11.4.
11.4 years, that's the average average tenure of an agent. What about an agency employee?
You mean a temporary employee or a...
Yeah.
Because we do have some on fixed-term contracts, and we have 400 staff who are contractors in our supply chain, and they'll only work with us while they're doing their project, which will normally be a flood defence scheme, for example. They're normally engineering.
So what would that be? What would be the average tenure for an agency project? Sorry. My colleagues is saying it would depend on the project, but what has been the average?
I don't think I'll give you an answer to that because it depends on what they're building.
Is that something you could send to us?
I'm not sure I've got it, but I'll have a look.
Okay. Chair, if we'll accept that in writing, if that's okay. In terms of incident response...
They have it.
If they have it, yes. In terms of your incident response, how has it been affected by your staff shortages?
Well, certainly last year when we were having industrial action, in some areas of the country we had very, very thin cover because it was only those volunteers who were willing to come onto duty at the weekend. And if you recall the winter, we actually had a series of weekend. For some reason, the storms tend to come at a weekend. So we had Barbet was a weekend. I think Hank was a weekend, if I recall correctly. So we had some areas of the country where we were very thin. We had to move staff and managers around the country to respond to that. Now, that is in the past. That's been resolved, that industrial dispute. And for the latter part of the winter, we had very good cover levels. And I'm very, very grateful for all those staff who volunteered to come in over Christmas, New Year and the weekends in January to provide that cover.
It is, however, an area that we are looking at. We have a voluntary system at the moment, and that can mean that a few people are going and dealing with emergencies on a regular basis, and we would like to extend that. So it is an area we shall be looking at.
I'm just trying to understand in that, because your latest corporate performance card, March 2024, is assessing incident responses as a red. In terms of your Q2 figure of 86% against a target of 96%. So I'm just trying to understand, is that affected by your staff?
The number of proportion of staff who are properly qualified and fully available, and that has dropped. That is partly we've got training backlog. I mean, general comment on this would be, this system worked fine if you had one or two very serious national storms a year. That would have been okay. Because in those couple of storms, people would have all surged in. They would have still had time to do their training. They wouldn't have been working weekend after weekend. But the situation we've just gone through, where we have, 7 named storms, is that right? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, meant that, and many other incidents, like we had the April coastal flooding in southern England, has meant that the same pool of people have been coming in, week out. And we are seeing some lower levels of volunteering and people not completing their mandatory training for those schemes, hence the rating you'll see in our performance card. The way through that would be to negotiate a different approach with our staff. I used to work in the Home Office. It was quite standard to have different terms and conditions. People worked out of hours and worked complete roster through evenings and weekends. It isn't great, given the importance of the agency, that we have a volunteer model when we have these really serious incidents.
I mean, it seems like the trajectory of incidents will go up, but you're also saying you believe got a reasonable, good complement of staff. Am I hearing that correctly?
You are, but you're also correct that actually with rising levels of heavy rain caused by climate change, we need to look at the model and check the model is resilient for the future. And I think that if you look at the pressure on some of our volunteers and actually some of the well-being issues reported by our trade unions over the winter, there are question marks whether this model is right. We have a project called IMX, which is looking at the future of incident response, both the IT, the rostering, but also how we reward our staff for doing incident response. And we are looking very broadly at what we should do to make sure we are resilient for the future. Currently, I think this winter has stretched us quite hard.
In terms of the planned increase in water company inspections, and therefore your announcements and repeated today, I think, Alan, you said 600. We thought you were having an increase of 500.
500. Yeah.
500. So how confident are you that you'll be able to recruit the staff needed to meet the planned?
Very confident. We've got off to a terrific start, and we're currently ahead of our plan. People are keen to work on this, and so yes, we are confident.
I mean, to give a sense of scale, we went to the market for our first 79 of those officers, and we had over 1,000 applications for those 79.
Okay. And just finally,
great interest to the public. So you have large numbers of citizen scientists doing the monitoring for you, not being paid to do it. So I'm not surprised, but encouraged to hear that.
Indeed, because my final question relates to just in terms of your measures to improve your workforce diversity. I'm interested to know, in particular, when you're answering that question, in terms of your senior management team, what that looks like as well. So, again, I think your latest charts indicate that you've not quite matched the diversity of the population. So tell me how that's going.
Well, good news first of all. So the agency, the proportion of staff who were black, Asian, minority ethnic over the last decade plateaued at 4.5%, which I think is very low for a public body. In the last year, largely because we centralised recruitment and we did much greater outreach to underrepresented groups, we managed to improve that to 6%, just a bit above 6%, which is a positive thing. And we set a target for this year of improving it by a further 1.5 percentage points, so taking it to 7.5%. Now, that would still be a very low number compared with the proportion of black, Asian, minority ethnic people living in the UK, near 18%. But it is a tangible sign that we are actually making progress, and we've had to work very hard to achieve that progress. Now, the problem we've got is that it's not just about recruiting people. They need to thrive when they get to the agency and stay with the agency, and then they need to get promotions. And we've got good news in terms of retention. We can now show that staff who join us from a black, Asian, minority ethnic background are more likely to stay for longer than their white counterparts. But we have a real problem in the pipeline of talent to get people to more senior grades. I am genuinely shocked that the agency doesn't have a talent programme in line with the ones we see right across the public sector and the civil service to provide sponsorship and develop opportunities for people from underrepresented groups to make it into senior management. I don't think we can be surprised, therefore, that the diversity level at the executive manager grade is much worse than it is at more junior staff and needs to be corrected. Now, we've made some very good hires externally in the last couple of years at EM level, but we haven't seen the flow of internal promotions. That really worries me. I think it accounts for one of the reasons why we see a race pay gap across the agency that I don't think is tolerable. So we will be taking action on that. It will start by developing an appropriate talent offer to make sure we're getting those promotions through, and that's the task for next year. But I think you put your finger on something that's a genuine performance problem we need to address.
Okay, right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Barry Gardner. Back to you.
I wanted to focus now on biodiversity and the agency's contribution to our biodiversity goals. If you look at your responsibility for preventing harm to wildlife and nature by habitat creation and improvement, I've worked out that it will be, on present form, 2194 will be the year by which you have achieved your target, because you've managed to create 823 hectares of your goal for 2028, which is 140,000 hectares. So it ain't looking very good, is it?
Stop.
Yeah, I do.
Let me give you the numbers I've got. So our corporate goal is to restore 20,000 further hectares by 2030. And this year we will have reached 1,912 hectares of priority habitat.
Sorry, I have a very different figure in front
I
of me.
hear that, yes, but that's what I've
Provide
got.
opportunities for biodiversity to flourish. The government's goal under the EIP 2030 is to restore or create 140,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitats.
I think that's
outside of protected
I
sites.
think that's the government's goal, and the government has many routes of doing that, principally through its principal regulator on biodiversity, Natural England, our colleagues, with whom we work very closely. We also, in the agency, also have a target to contribute towards that, and our target is 20,000 hectares. And we are doing fairly well against that. It might be worth me saying a bit about the challenges in that. So this year, the greatest contribution towards our 1,912 hectares was actually on blanket bog and lowland peatland, where we're doing, I think, a lot linked, if I'm wholly frank with you, to our work on flood prevention, because that is often the method through which we drive biodiversity. But across our 300 projects delivered this year, we have a further 155 hectares of coastal and floodplain grazing marsh, 114 hectares of woodland, 53 hectares of lowland meadow, 35 hectares of intertidal mudflaps. And that's a pretty positive offer. We are worried about this.
Sorry, can I just stop you for a second? You said it's 20,000 is your target. Your target
2030.
By 2030. I make your present rate then that it's going to take 24 years to achieve that.
Last year we did 1,900 as chief executive.
823 according.
No, 1,912 is the number I've got for the 23-24 target, which we met.
Sorry, I'm looking at the 22-23. So you've upped your rate, but it's still going to take a lot longer than 2030, isn't it?
It's going to take 10 years, isn't it, at 2,000 hectares a year, yeah. So our current target is 20,000 hectares.
You're not going to achieve it till mid-decade, next decade.
Honest answers, we don't know, because most of our... So we're not regulating other people's land. When we do this, we are constructing flood defences, and we're doing it in a biodiversity net gain manner. That's our principal route through which we deliver improvements. And so the scale and rate of our work will depend very much on the nature of the floods programme, which, as you know, finishes in 2027. And depending on the shape of the next programme, which is as yet unagreed, we don't actually know how much we will be doing on flood defences.
You wouldn't be telling me that you had a target that you hadn't worked out that you could achieve.
Well, I would be telling. That's what I just said. Yes, that is accurate. We have a target, but it depends upon future spending decisions. That is the accurate position. That's not unusual in government, not unusual in DEFRA either. Future governments have to work out if they wish to proceed with that target, but if they do, they will need to finance the work required.
Okay, and do you have the finance in place to do that?
We have finance 2027 under the SR. That programme is under some pressure, as you know, but the good news is we've moved more money into nature-based solutions, so that will mean that we'll deliver our flood protection and greater hectares of protected land.
Okay, well, I think this is an area where you would have to agree that there is more work to be done.
Well, I'm not sure I do, really. I think you've got to look at the government strategies as a whole on biodiversity net gain. We are a small part of that picture.
We're talking about your contribution to it.
Yes.
At the moment, it is not on track.
It was on track last year, but you make a good point that we haven't got a fully funded plan to 2030.
Not for 2030, it wasn't, was it?
Well, it was a 10-year programme at 2,000 a year, and it was from 21 to 30, 20,000 hectares.
You've only just got up to the...
I agree. So we are a bit behind. But for the year 23-24, we were on the average rate required. We need to do better, yes.
Tell me about the situation with local authorities. Do you believe that they've got the capacity to carry out their duties in relation to biodiversity net gain and the local nature recovery strategies? And how do you work with them to enhance their work for biodiversity net gain?
My instinct is that that's not what part of our remit, because as the Chief Executive said, Natural England is the prime driver of biodiversity net game. And I think it would be for them to work with the other agencies. I think we are targeted with our part of that, but not with the broader.
We come across them, of course, because for our flood defence schemes we require both BNG and planning consent, and I think it's a very early stage for the new regime. We are providing to Natural England, and as they prepare their local nature recovery strategies, significant input on the water environment and how you might measure BNG on water environment measures. But if you look at some schemes we've delivered recently, the market is very immature, and a lot of authorities are struggling with how they would take off sites, for example, qualify them. It's a real challenge.
I think it's a...
Forgive me, but everything seems to come back to water, and whilst I appreciate it's a huge amount of the work of the Environment Agency, it's not the only element of the work. In terms of pollution, in terms of waste, the impact on biodiversity there, can we just broaden out the site a little? Sorry, am I being unreasonable?
I don't think that the discussion has gone regularly to water except in response to specific questions. But certainly on this one, I do think it's a question more for Natural England. I share one element of your question. I can imagine that the local authority funding position may put this under some challenge, but that's not something that we are responsible for.
The reason we find this hard question to answer, Mr. Gardner, is that we're looking at installations. You're, of course, absolutely right. Take ammonia, for example. Ammonia has profound implications for nature, for plant life. And so the agency, as the regulator of ammonia emitters, has a critical role to play in protecting nature by enforcing rules on ammonia, arguably true for methane and other areas. So we clearly do have a critical role to play. The way we think about that is we think about the limits for ammonia emission from regulated installations. We don't think about it necessarily in terms of hectares of land improved, unless we are actually working on that land ourselves, which we are doing occasionally through our flood defence scheme. So we're looking for a different lens to the local nature-based recovery schemes. But what you'd hear from my colleague Marion, if she were here from Natural England, is the importance she would place in Natural England on making sure that those pollutants, those persistent pollutants, are under control, and the contribution the agency can make to biodiversity recovery is making sure that some of those pollutants are reducing consistently, and volatile organics, ammonia, the list. So that, I think, may explain why we're struggling to answer your question about the hectares in that way.
The hectares was a separate question. I then asked about the relationship with local authorities and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll leave it there, Chair. I think we'll leave it there.
Very good. I'm conscious we have run over time. Are you okay for another 10 minutes, and then we'll be clear? Thank you. Jerome Mayhew.
Thank you very much. Apologies for being late. I had to be in somewhere else first. I'm just going to talk about whistleblowing, just to get a flavour of getting on there. Organisations, large organisations, for some reason, massively struggle with whistleblowing right across the public sector. So, mark your own homework. How do you think you're doing on whistleblowing?
Let's start with the good. So I think protection of sources is very good, and we just had a review by Sir Brian Leveson of how we're handling confidential sources. We're looking very hard at making sure that if you do whistleblow to us, you can be confident that your identity and your information will be adequately protected through layers of appropriate controls. So that is, I hope, reassuring that we're taking that seriously. Worth saying, you may think, well, why do you need such protection? But we're often receiving whistleblowing from people involved in industries where there is organised crime involved, and therefore it's absolutely imperative that the identity of whistleblowers is fully protected. And that can mean at times it's very hard to take action on the whistleblowing because we can't ever share with anyone that we knew this thing, but we do look after that intelligence. Secondly, we are making sure that the water industry understand their obligations on whistleblowing, and one of them is to make sure that their staff know they can whistleblow to the company they work for, or they can whistleblow to us. They can also whistleblow.
You're happy with that? That's the right approach.
Yeah, so that's in line with generalised government guidance on whistleblowing. What's interesting, you look at what comes through the whistleblowing portals is you actually don't get much formal whistleblowing, i.e. someone works for a company telling you something about the company they work for. And I think that betokens the fact that we actually got lots of other things going on in the water environment. We've got complaints, we've got people dissatisfied with decisions, lots of things in that. We're working through all those areas. But I think there is value in making sure that everyone knows they can let us know about malpractice. It's also worth noting we have taken action on particularly water company malpractice, and we will take action if we hear that.
Well, on the action taking, because to become a whistleblower, it's a big decision. You're worried about your future career, you're worried about your relationships with your other co-workers, you could become a pariah in your industry, and there are far too many real examples where that has in fact taken place, and it begs the question, why would you be a whistleblower? And one of the reasons why you'd be a whistleblower is if you thought, you know what, I'm going to do the hard yards because action will be taken to rectify a wrong. But if you look at the whistleblowing history from the Environment Agency, I've just got the data here from April 22 to 31st of March 2023, where there were 15 whistleblowing disclosures, and of these, only one disclosure led even to a new inspection. So if your test to pass is that, don't worry, we'll back you if you're a whistleblower, we'll make your whistleblowing count, you fail, don't you?
No, because your numbers aren't right. Let me give you other numbers. So there's 16 whistleblowers came into our portal since it opened.
I said 15, okay.
So only 2 of those would be technically qualified as whistleblowers since they were related to former employees talking about their previous employer, which is the definition of whistleblowing. And they were reporting historic events from employment that happened 9 and 15 years ago. Now, there is merit in discussing what happened 15 years ago, but it's unlikely to lead to an immediate prosecution. Of the remaining reports we received, 5 related to alleged waste activities. They will go into our intelligence picture. Quite often we're aware of those waste activities. 2 were people talking about water pollution. It is useful, and we do have a portal reporting water pollution, but it's not whistleblowing. In both occasions, they related towards sewerage, and then others related to other environmental health matters at the local authority level. So I don't think the picture you're painting of lots of genuine whistleblowers reporting very serious malpractice in water companies and us ignoring their activity, that is not accurate. If we had reports of that sort, we would have taken action on them. We have done in the past. I can assure you we will take action on whistleblowing if we see it of that sort. Just to be clear, I don't want to be at all derisory towards the other reports we got. They are valid reports of environmental harm. They do deserve respect, and they will be action will be taken on them, but they're not prosecutions or enforcement against water companies. They're a different sort of allegation.
It's like a case where the papers that we have seem to have different figures. Well, I won't challenge you on those because you've got your view, and perhaps we'll look into it as a committee, which are the right figures. Okay, but let's say you're right, which I'm sure you are. Then what you're really saying is there just aren't any whistleblowing or significant whistleblowing activities coming from water companies towards the Environment Agency. So isn't that in itself a bad news story? Or is the assumption that or the conclusion that you draw that these are wonderfully operated businesses where there is no malpractice that needs to be exposed?
I don't draw those conclusions. I don't think it means it's a bad news story, or that all the water companies are perfect. It's very early days.
We're only 3 weeks in.
We haven't had very long of this. You wouldn't expect there to be that many reports of very serious corporate malpractice in a regulated industry, but there may be some. So I'm not expecting huge volumes to come through the whistleblowing portal. And we'll see how that regime develops in the course of the year ahead.
And the training of your staff to deal with this, as you say, it's a new system. Are you confident that you're in a good position to respond to what comes in through the front?
Yes, we handle this completely separately to the rest of our work via a specialised team. And that's necessary because obviously they have to have certain protections.
Chair, back to you.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of questions to conclude on waste crime. You mentioned, Alan, earlier that the cap on fines for water companies has been removed. It was also removed in December, I think, for waste crime.
It was.
Has that impacted yet on your ability to manage waste crimes? Have you used those powers?
Not to my knowledge.
No, I don't think we have. It's we have decent level of prosecutions in the waste sector, but as I mentioned earlier, they too often go to magistrate courts and get a trivial fines. So one area that we need to look at is further education of the court system in order to improve that. But certainly we need to do more in this space. I think we would agree with that. But equally, we are getting after a good number of the right people, and these are, of course, these are criminals. There's no doubt. This I do think is different from the water space, where there is a lack of investment and other things that have affected what's happening. But in the waste space, these are criminals, and we are set on getting after them with all measures that we have.
You have referenced a lack of officers, or the difficulty in recruiting officers.
Yeah, that's true.
To manage waste crime. Is that changing? Are you focused on this now?
We've put in £15 million more with the government support into waste crime, which means we have the specialist teams we require. I mean, my view on what would actually do the trick is you need to basically attack this problem from every direction. So you need to be using proceeds of crime orders to seize illegally acquired benefits. You need a great partnership with HMRC to make sure that the tax evasion is being dealt with, and I'm pleased to say that's really improved recently. You need to look at things like travel bans, driving licence bans, things that make it harder to commit these kinds of offences, and you need to use prison. Now, we are getting prison sentences. We're getting 2.5 year prison sentences. That's probably not a huge deterrent for people who are involved in organised crime. So that, I think, is what we need to be doing on the kind of more difficult end. And that, I think, is, there's some good evidence that actually the number of illegal waste sites is stable or slightly falling, which is positive news. I think where the unlimited penalties may come in is in the non-compliant, non-criminal sector, where I think there may be a more of a credible threat to them to make sure they comply. In the last few months, we've been using suspension. And thinking about suspension, of course, is it gives them a chance to correct the problem, which is only right, but it also denies them income while they're correcting it, since they can't use the site during that time. And that really has focused minds, I think, for the non-compliant legal operators.
In my county, there's a consultation going on at the moment about the potential closure of recycling centres, which may or may not happen. Are you noticing that around the country? And if so, do you then notice an increase in fly tipping as a consequence?
A great question, I don't know.
I don't know the answer.
Would be very helpful to me locally, which perhaps might be slightly unfair,
that's fine.
using my position.
It's privilege. Yeah.
If you could ask any one of the relevant officers and drop me a note about that would be very helpful. And the government has, we have the Secretary of State for DEFRA before the EFRA committee, which I attended, where he confirmed that the DRS scheme is likely now to be deferred until implemented in 2027. Do you have a view about that, as to whether that's going to make your life more difficult?
I'll give an operational view. I mean, the complexity and ambition of what the government's trying to achieve on waste is phenomenal. This year's big task is to get the extended producer responsibility for household packaging done. We've opened registration for that. We've got more than 5,000 people registered. So that is good progress towards that scheme. I think the government is right to ensure that each stage of this journey, each bit of these 13 measures they're doing is timed so it works properly. In the deposit return scheme, we've been involved with looking at things like how you'd mitigate fraud risk, how you'd manage the money, how you'd define what was in scope, how you work across the 4 nations and regions to make that work. That work is all going quite well in terms of the policy work. So I think it's not unreasonable for the government to just pause and check the go live date will actually work, and it'll be secure when it starts. But getting next year the go live date for the extended piece of responsibility is a massive milestone, and that's very much our focus. And we need to bring in more staff to do that as well.
Perhaps I could just add, the waste reform programme as a whole is something that we have been working closely with DEFRA on throughout the period. We are ticking off bits of it. We would love to have had it all done by now. It needs to remain front and centre of government effort through the next 5 years. Then we can clear off this and other points.
We had a hearing on e-waste, electronic waste,
That's exactly
very recently, where there's been much less progress than we'd hoped for. So we will be. Are there any? We'll be writing to the government about that. Are there any recommendations in that area that you would like us to emphasise to government?
Well, they're thinking about doing routine curbside collection, which I think would be a major step forward. They're looking at all the definitional issues, particularly around battery recycling, which is really important. So I think the government's got a credible plan. The difficulty is just operationalising that huge change.
Okay. Final question. Have either of you asked a question amongst yourselves or amongst the board as to whether the EA is fit for purpose?
I can't say that I've asked that specific question around the board, but I do feel that the board is a very good organisation now. I think it's a strong body, and I am confident that they would give a positive response to that. We are just hiring 2 new people. They start on the 1st of April, about to come to their first meeting, and both will help us in the digital and innovation sphere, which, as Philip said earlier, is one of the areas where we think we need to do more. One of them was, for 10 years, the head of IT digital at American Airlines, and the other is a 31-year-old young lady with fantastic innovation potential, and will be full of good news, good ideas for us. So I'm confident in the answer to that, but I also recognise that there is a lot more we can do.
I think for the country, having 1,400 scientists who deeply understand and care about ecology, having this level of engineering expertise, that we know how we run and manage our assets and keep London safe every day with the Thames Barrier, having a depth of data is a huge asset for the nation. I don't think there's one answer to your question. I think in areas, and we've mentioned water today, I don't think we have been doing our job well enough, and we will correct those areas. But I think people who work in the agency will be proud of their achievements, and I'm proud of what they do every day. So I don't think that's the question we're quite going to answer yet.
I think that concludes our session. Thank you very much, Alan Lovell and Philip Duffy from the Environment Agency. Order.
Thank you very much.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.